Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. I'm so excited every week. I'm a happy person, but I'm especially happy this week. Sarah Razor gets to come back on the podcast. If you recall last time, we were talking about the Kentucky Derby. She was over there. She was doing the thing, living the dream as an emergency manager over there. But she got hired at the University of Kentucky. And so I thought it'd be great to catch up with her. She's coming up on a year and hear her thoughts moving from one sector to the other sector and, all the things. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring Sarah on to the stage. Sarah, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm always happy to be here.
So let's talk about you, and you. How has life been? You're missing your first Kentucky Derby in 4 years. How are you doing? All the things.
It's pretty good. I would say that the crowd that goes to the Derby is not the same crowd that goes to UK football games, but same planning, same effort goes into it. So
no big hats at the football games, huh?
Yeah, I think people in the stands tend to get mad at you if you block their view. So
who knew?
A little bit different.
Honestly, we do a lot of work with MLS now. Like I was on another podcast, I was talking about the Portland Timbers. And I also was in Europe with watching Napoli versus Barcelona. And it's a cool experience, except for the giant flags. And I was so grateful I was not sitting in the section where, the entire game would be basically can't see anything. So I don't know how that works for people, but definitely not a football match. That would never work.
No, but you think about it. Think about the decision they make for those prohibited items, though. You talk about Kentucky Derby. Everybody wants banners. Football, everybody wants flags. Can't do it.
So in terms of going from the crowds to the crowd, right? What are the stark differences for you? And were there any surprises?
I would say both crowds are passionate to be there, which is always great. But really looking at the crowd type throughout Churchill at the Derby, there's so many different crowd types that are there. You have the people that go and stay in dining rooms that are there kind of for the experience, the spectacle, to hang out with people. You have people that are there for once in a lifetime trips. People that come to a UK football game, it may be a lifetime trip, but these are committed fans. These are people that are coming back and back. They usually know their entrance. They know their exit. They come in the same way every time. They're usually a lot more familiar with the venue. So just talking from a crowd management perspective, Churchill, the lift to get people that had never set foot in a venue and want to stop every 5 feet to look at everything, ingress, egress, it's so much easier and so much easier to manage when you have a plan that's so well laid out, a venue like Kroger Field, and just these guests that, they've come, some of them have come their whole life. So, just a crowd capacity for directing them. Totally.
How large is the stadium?
I think we have around 40 to 60,000, depending on kind of the factor of standing room only.
Yeah. That's interesting. So when you're talking about lifelong fans of University of Kentucky football, I'm from Ohio. So winning tradition is very important in Ohio. So it's just kind of funny to compare different programs and different sports. We were just talking about how, professional soccer and the large banners versus, Kentucky Derby and University of Kentucky football and all those crowd dynamics, right? Yep. Over the last year and working within the university system, and keep it on a general scale, obviously, but from a university perspective and maybe the Kentucky Derby from the business end, I'm assuming they're same objectives, right? They want their fans to have a good time. They want them to stay in, get some food, spend some extra money, but have a good time, and then get out, right? If those are the overall thoughts, how do you work in the security thing? Because we talked about that last time and working through the priorities of wanting to do security, but making sure it doesn't take away from the fan experience. How does working within the university program work?
I would say for any event, whether it's a huge special event, the Derby, or a routine football game, basketball game, it's branding. I mean, security and events is branding. It's, can you make it to where it's something that they see over and over again that they're going to remember? Or is it just a prohibited item list that's posted on your website? I mean, it's really getting the partners that are kind of your guest services representatives, your athletics department. They have to be on board with what you're doing, because you don't have every person in the venue sitting there saying, hey, you can't bring that in, or yeah, you can't find your child right now. Let me tell you exactly where to direct you. You've lost the battle. I mean, it's all about, that's one thing with emergency management is we love to write plans for first responders, but when you're training venue staff, they don't necessarily already know what a shelter in place looks like. They don't know what an evacuation looks like. So you have to kind of look at the plan that you wrote for first responders, get that to a staff level and be able to train those people. Because if they don't understand it, chances are your first responders are going to go back to their training and have none of the hundreds of other hands there that could help them knowing what they're doing. It's just going to be more people to trip over. So that's the big factor, is you have to get it to where the people understand it, it's simple enough, and the staff that are working the venue remember it, know how to communicate it at any kind of event.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapsed and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. If you served in the military, you've probably worn Proper Apparel. Proper Apparel is now reaching out to first responders and those who love the outdoors. Check out Proper Apparel. From the outdoors to the EOC, wear proper. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. Assuming your boss is going to watch this podcast, is it awkward to offer you a job while we're talking? Because we go into stadiums, and that is 100% true. We'll read either plans. Now, there's a lot of stadiums. I don't want to disparage anybody, but when security with only a security background is writing an emergency management plan, sometimes there's steps that are missed. The same thing that happens from any kind of field, right? Like if my background's law enforcement, I'm going to be focused on the law enforcement side. If my background's fire, I'm going to be focused only on fire. And so emergency management is a bit more holistic there. However, the number one tapped it, like the least tapped in resource that I've seen in stadium is guest services. You have hundreds of eyes and ears out there who can be reporting back. We don't want them to intervene necessarily, but we want them to see and want to know what's going on. And we've been in places where they'll have a policy of no cell phones for guest services because they want the experience, but that everybody gets a radio. So how do you communicate back if something's happening, right? And so the fact that you were able just to within it sounds like a single season immediately be able to call that out of saying hey, how do we get all these other people on board? My perspective is that guest services tap into that resource, and it's called lots of different things from different stadiums, essentially ushers. What in your perspective is the least tapped in resources that we should reach out to if we're starting to work with either stadiums or any kind of dynamic population, amusement parks, the whole deal? Who do you want to be interacting with from a planning perspective?
I mean, this is where I say you have one major planning meeting, bring everybody to the table, get the perspectives, and then kind of divvy it out from there. I mean, you're going to have people that work near the concession stands. They're going to have different perspectives than the people that work in dining rooms or that work in the parking lot. And they may not all need to be in the same planning meeting. I think that's the major mistake that some people make, is that you think that these planning meetings have to be massive and full on kind of productions, but make some working groups, get it to where you have the same people that have same interests together, but then also have those major planning meetings where you update and say, speak up now if this impacts you. Let's get it on the table in front of everyone. If this impacts what you're doing, say it now.
And quite frankly, the smaller groups make it a bit more encouraging for people to speak up, right? When they get in the big meeting, they're like, oh, my boss is going to say something, or, security always leads this. But if you get in with those smaller groups, that's when they're really going to bring up. And quite frankly, also to gauge their interest. When they're in such a small group and they can't run away, you're going to find out if they actually care about it or not. And if they don't, getting them on board is so important. On the other hand, sometimes we always plan for the terrorist attack, but the most realistic thing is, domestic violence, two friends fighting it out when they're drunk or whatever.
You have to be a big proponent if you work in events of venue familiarization. I mean, that's something we saw at Churchill is we had first responders that we worked with every year. They were fantastic. They knew the venue, but it wasn't until we started to connect them with guest services walkthroughs because you're going to have your ushers, your guest services that are getting familiar with the language that guests use for the venue that law enforcement doesn't. So why don't you just connect them when they do walkthroughs? Your law enforcement walkthrough doesn't need to be just tactically oriented. This is what we call it. This is your medical stations. It can be, hey, yeah, this is guest services. This is how they communicate. This is the words that the guests use. If they're looking at the big mural of all the horses on the wall, this is where that is.
Yeah, and every place has their own vernacular too. Like, you know, um, I did the emergency plan for. I'm trying to connect a lot of dots here for people. I did an emergency plan for my kids' preschool, but it's a huge preschool. It was like seriously, I think they have like 30 classes of like 15 kids, massive place. So it's kind of big. But the evacuation map, when I was looking at it, like I covered it up one time, and I asked my kid's teacher because I'm kind of a jerk. I said, "Hey, where are we at in the building? Like, what's the number?" Because it didn't match. Like when you think of floors, you think first floor, second floor, third floor. They were using letters and then letters for wings. So it was like A-2 was the wing, but the window was Roman numeral. So like Roman numeral 3, A-4. It's like it was so complicated. Like not I would never memorize it. The teacher didn't know it. So just like trying to find like the things that just make life easier,
Yeah.
right? I'm talking too much on this podcast because I'm excited, but essentially,
Don't reinvent the wheel, man. If everybody knows the little "you are here" star and you need to put that on your evacuation maps, do it. I mean,
yeah.
X marks the spot, something that everybody already knows.
So let me ask you this because sometimes I get this question and I try to take it seriously. But like when you say exactly that, right? Like, hey, everybody uses the same thing. I get this response back sometimes like, well, what if the terrorists learn like what this thing is? So we got to use something different to trip them up. Like, how do you I know. Again, I try to take it seriously because people always think of like a Hollywood version of like this is going like active shooters, right? Like active shooters, that's the scary scenario for a lot of people, and it is. But they think it's like a Hollywood thing where they've been casing it out forever, and there is some like data from the FBI of like 8 steps to terrorism, and I get that, but they're not using like advanced like technology. They're not connected to some kind of magical view of the stadium. So how do you balance of like reality versus innovative solutions? I guess that took me a while to get to that, but
I mean, you have to, this is where your leadership has to make a risk decision, right? Is that do you value the potential to trip up your own people or do you value the potential to trip up a terrorist? Because what's more likely at a stadium? A fire, terrorist attack? Do you want to trip up your people and getting out of the building for a fire just because of the likelihood of the terrorist attack?
which has, yeah. I mean, we always plan for the worst case scenario, sure, but I want to be a
Absolutely.
doomsday prepper either. I love that. I think that's a great response, right? Like, who are you thinking of first? And you really should be thinking of the people who are responding first, and then those relationships that you have to manage. In your job, just switching gears here a little bit, you're obviously focusing a lot on the stadium. Is it only the stadium, or are you doing other areas within University of Kentucky as well?
Yeah, so the team that I work on covers mainly the campus side, and I kind of act as the liaison between campus and our healthcare emergency management side. So our police department actually oversees both. So we're unique in that area, but we do academic buildings, classrooms, the hospital, clinics, offsite clinics. We handle all aspects of it.
Outside of the stadium, because I think it's a passion area for you. What's the other passion area for you?
I mean, I'm probably gonna hit on two, is I'm gonna use the keyword of resilience that everybody just really loves. And then students. I mean, I love to get back to academia. Students are the first priority to me, is that if we can get them, If you can have someone that rotates through your university in an average of 4 years know how to evacuate, how to shelter, how to call 911, that's something that's not going to leave them. They're going to go into any other venue for the rest of their life. Saying that, let's say they're average 18 to 22-year-olds, you've now caught how much of the population that is going to be so much better prepared for the rest of their life if you can train them something in college that is a life skill to say, know where your exits are, know when to stay inside somewhere because it's not safe outside, and know how to call 911 or report an emergency. That's the big push, is get the information to students and then figure out how to prepare your team before recovery for resilience. Because I'm going to argue that resilience is not a recovery word, but people might not like that.
Let's talk about that because, yeah, actually, I'm hyper curious. Can you just expound on what you mean literally by that? I do want to go back to the student thing because smart answer. But resiliency is not about recovery.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to explain it is think of the human factor of resilience in that emergency management is unique and you are trying to train a team to work at 100% efficiency at 60 to 70% of their effort for the majority of their job. Because if they're at 100% of their capacity and 100% of their effort, they're done before the incident starts. So if you're not worried about your team or your facility's resilience and mitigation, you've lost recovery. Like, you're done. Your people are burnt out. You're not coming back from it. You have to be resilient before you even start an incident to be resilient.
Yeah, I've gotten so much flack on this on the show because I've talked about this so much. But I do like your angle on that. Sometimes I'm saying this over and over again at nauseum, so people stop messaging me on it. But some people think I'm against resiliency, and that's stupid. I'm not against resiliency, obviously. My thing is, I don't want to have to be resilient.
Yeah.
And when I need to be resilient, heck yeah, I want to be the most resilient thing in the world. I want to be able to bounce back, get going, and I love that. If you're at max capacity, you're done before you started, you know. And I think that's incredibly wise. However, mitigation for me is like top dog. If I can mitigate everything, and you can't, right? Murphy's law is real, so you have to be resilient, right? But that should be the fallback of mitigation. And the other problem I see, I go all over the country. I'm going to the UK in like a month. Everybody talks about mitigation the same way wrong, like you just said on resiliency, and I agree with you. Like, they all want to mitigate after as a recovery option.
Yep.
You miss the whole, like, what mitigation is if you're having to do it in recovery. Build back better, great. But why aren't you doing that on the front end? It's so much cheaper. You don't have to deal with lives lost. So for you and stadiums and mitigation, not taking away from the fan experience, and also trying to be resilient, what are you specifically doing to make sure that you're not at max capacity?
I mean, for me, it was the big decision of just look at the plans that you have to write, the job you have to do, and you have to prioritize it. I mean, emergency managers are notorious for saying, I have to finish so much because I'm never going to be ahead of the 8 ball. Yeah, you do. You're right. But at some point you have to say, I also have to get home. I have to sleep. I have to see my family. I have to do something creative. My whole office will know already that I'm a New York Times crossword puzzle nerd because I think that it brings generations together because you're not going to be able to answer all of the questions. And it's something that you can sit down and say, let's do a 3-minute crossword puzzle, takes the tension off of going in to talk about a terrorist attack. And then you can have the meeting. You have to have some flexibility to know that you're not going to be able to write all of your plans that you want to write today.
Okay, real talk. We're not hiring you today, but if I ever hire you, now I know to have one of my staff, like Denny or Maxine, send you a 2-word crossword puzzle, and it'll be you're hired. That'll be fun. So we'll now I know. We'll keep that in the queue. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, there's also the adrenaline factor, right? Like, it's not a high because you don't want people to be getting hurt. I definitely don't fantasize about people getting hurt. And there's a whole other thing about me getting annoyed by people like pretending they're the hero in their sick fantasy of people getting hurt. But at the same time, like, I got into emergency management because I like helping in emergencies, and I want to be like ready for that.
Yep.
Right. You can just tell when somebody doesn't have that it factor. and they're just frazzled all the time. And you're like, I'd be so nervous to be in any kind of incident with you. Because, like, even on the day-to-day stuff, you're overwhelmed. How are you supposed to manage yourself when things are overwhelming? You know?
And then it's been so, I don't know if you've seen the like quote going around on LinkedIn about your lack of planning isn't my emergency. And I'm like, this is the one career field where that's such a lie, is like your lack of planning is my emergency. But if you're freaking out over the planning side of it, like that should be the part that you can handle, or you know how to handle the stress of. Because if you don't know that part well, and granted, I take this with the caveat of saying if you're in your first few years, no, like you have to go through a few activations. You have to see a few things to be able to get to the point where you're like, okay, I can sit down and think. But my biggest, anytime somebody asks me what they can do to get into emergency management, learn how to write well. Because if you can't put together a situation report for me when I'm sitting down and saying what's actually happening, what are you doing? And that's a hard thing to say. It's a hard skill that nobody wants to practice, but get really good at summarizing a lot of information really quickly and efficiently.
As somebody who has the spelling capacity of a third grader, I am so grateful for spell check,
Yeah.
for grammar check, for ChatGPT. It has been a game changer for me. Like AI and AI writing, like Claude and ChatGPT and some of these other ones. If you're worried, this is for an audience. If you're worried that you're a poor writer, even just quietly write something up and then throw it into one of these things and say, does this look well, does it, is it, where could it be fixed, and just start training yourself of what is a normal sentence structure. One of the other problems I see in emergency management a lot, besides like the lack of writing ability, is being concise. Oh my gosh, if you're, it goes back to, I'm picking on EM a little bit this episode, but you're cool, you get it. I have seen so many definitions of emergency management. I reject them all now because we came up with our own. But part of the reason I decided to do that is because we would see like these like 4-paragraph definitions of what emergency management is, and the second paragraph would be trying to explain what the first paragraph meant, like because they didn't want to use like English, so they made up their own word that doesn't mean that word, and then they're trying to explain what that means for their context. Like, if you can't use plain language, going back to your thing of first responders versus like, events management, you're not helping anybody. If you can't explain what you do, how are you expect senior leadership to have any kind of trust in who you are, because they won't know what you do?
Well, and words are so important in the sense of training staff, training students, whatever it is, to know there's a difference between fire and smoke. There's a difference between wind and tornado. Like if you're going to report, there's a difference between a water heater leaking, I mean, from a household perspective, and pooling water. Like you have to understand that words matter a lot, because so much of this, I mean, I sit in our EOC at campus. If someone is telling me that a building is on fire, there's a difference between the response that I take in the EOC, or there's smoke in the building but no visible fire. And that's the big, people I think so many times underestimate the value of sitting down and just putting it in the simple format of, this is a sentence. I don't need it to have semicolons. I don't need it to have fancy language. I need it to be, this is what I see, period.
My writing got so much better when I decided to get away from using commas. I was the guy who like thought, well, here's one problem that some people have. If they have a sales background or they have a public speaking background, we write like the way that we would deliver a speech. And even worse, we'll read it like we gave a speech. But there's such a difference between technical writing and narrative writing. And far too common, I get people, I'll literally ask for a writing sample when we hire them. Because even though my spelling's terrible, I know how to read and I know how to write for conciseness.
Well, I think we've talked about, my background is academia. I have a little bit of the events management side. By a little bit, I mean the Kentucky Derby, which maybe doesn't count as a little bit. But you have that where academia trains you to write one way. It trains you to write, to tell a story, to communicate. But really, the switch that it took to understand that what I was going to tell somebody in person is the same thing I needed to put on paper. I mean, if you're worried about not knowing how to write, then act like you're sitting there telling your boss what's going on and write that. Don't just sit there and say, I need to have a full page because it's what I was trained on, especially the new emergency managers. The 5 to 10 page MLA papers that you had to write on a tornado, if you give that to someone, you're going to get through maybe the first paragraph and then be like, I can't, like this, I don't have time for it now.
One of the greatest terms I learned from working with military units was bluff. Bottom
Mm-hmm.
line up front. Just give me the one sentence and 5 bullet points. And if it's interesting to me, I'm going to read the next part. I'm going to read the next part or skip down to where I need. And we would be much better as a field by just getting better at, short, simple. The leader is never going to read your long form anyways. Like, people just need to get away from that. At the same time, you need to be able to explain yourself. So there's a space to do each one of those things. When we do emergency operations plans as a company now, I can't think of an EOP that was longer than 50 pages at this point. We have annexes, and that makes it longer, sure. But like most of ours are like 25 pages because we know that most of the people who are going to be reading it are going to flip to the one page and say, what is my role and my responsibility? And then we can train to that. The 2,000-page EOPs, while that's beneficial for something like the Super Bowl,
Yep.
it's because they have 2,000 entities they're working with, But most organizations, their EOPs need to be much more shorter. I don't know. That's just my perspective.
Yeah, and I have such a frustration when you look at event action plans that, of course, everybody loves the FEMA ICS forms, but an event action plan is so useless to first responders when it's in that format. They have to flip back and forth to see who's on what assignment, who's where, because so much of it is they want to see the whole operation right then. If you can figure out a way that you can make an event action plan digital with maps, with some pinpointing for GPS, with any of the checklists so that if an incident occurs, they get the notification of their phone to say, do XYZ. That is how you get it to where it's functional. When you have these 40-page event action plans that look like an ICS form, which is a great place to start. It's the great fundamentals that you have to keep that information in the plan. But I don't think I know a first responder that in the event of a crisis is going to say, oh, let me go to my 204 and see exactly who I have and what I need to do and make sure that I know exactly who I have with them. If they don't know who they're going in with, that's a training issue. That's not an event action plan issue. They have to know who's working it, who they're with.
Yeah, I see 3 sides of many more sides that I probably don't know of yet. However, you have like your angle. Then you have wildland firefighters who are ICS to something I'd never seen before. When I went out to a wildfire in California and I saw how they were doing ICS, I was like, oh, FEMA doesn't know how to do ICS. It was so beautiful to watch the process happen in real time. And then there's the FEMA perspective. So many people, every emergency manager has to know ICS. Every emergency manager needs to understand the forms. That's verbatim, sure. But people forget that process is written for FEMA to be able to interact with the state. If you're in a county, it has to go up to the state, ultimately up to FEMA. So FEMA really only cares about their process, and that's how it works for them. Using an incident action plan, like people try to create those for universities or for like hospitals. I'm like, that's a legal document between what the federal government will do and the state will do. That doesn't even make sense if you're working internally for your group. Like, we have to start recognizing that FEMA and those things are great for FEMA, but that doesn't mean that there's a standard for the industry. Like, that doesn't mean you should fall back on that. I don't know.
Yeah, but I would also, I argue that every team, we have what we lovingly call our ICS nerd on our team. And she started out at FEMA. She has degrees in emergency management. She is the on the nose if you want to know what form goes where and through what position in ICS. And she knows it. And it's great to have her because she knows what you can't bend. Like, there are parts in a process that you maybe don't want to mess with, but look at how it fits academia is totally different. We have people that, for me to get them to the point where they understand FEMA system, we don't have the time for that. I have to get them to where they understand UK system. But having someone that understands a system that gets the job done let's take those principles, apply it to what we do, figure it out. But you have to have someone that has that starting point of saying, yeah, I really understand how these forms work. I understand this communication. Let me figure out what parts we need to change and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, you said it right. Principles, right? There's a lot of people. I wouldn't say a lot of people. There's some people who think they're bending the rule, but they don't know the rule. You have
Mm-hmm.
to know the rule inside and out. And the principle of ICS is templates, standardization, process, and really the big thing that sometimes we overlook is auditing. You have to audit what you did, not only for resources and for financial tracking, which is huge, but be able to justify your actions. And so ICS is a great fallback for that. But if you, I don't know, there's like these two sides of this. It's like this conflicting thing every time, right? We need to understand the standards. I want to ask you. This is like another like just like random pick your brain thing. So we're moving on here a little bit, but experts. A lot of people call themselves an expert. In your mind, an expert in emergency management, do they have to have deployment experience or activation experience?
I would tend to say an expert needs to have both some sort of professional training and some sort of deployment training.
Can you say that one more time?
No, because I know the flack that I'll get for that one.
It's true though. There's so many people that have an academic background. That includes, and this is going to be a little offensive, people who've had job titles that make them think have experience, but they have no still activation experience. And I will hire those people. I think the academic experience is fantastic. When I say academic, you have the degrees or you've been to FEMA training. Great. I will even hire people who have been in cool jobs that give them a different perspective of EM. But if they don't have activation experience, they're just not an expert. I'm sorry. Like the White House, if the White House is not going to call you, you're not an expert.
Yep.
If you're not going to represent the federal government at a NATO training, I'm not going to think you're an expert because you're just a self-declared nothing.
But I also think that's the major lift that a manager has to build the team is that like we have a good balance of military law enforcement experience, great, academic experience, kind of the FEMA ICS world experience. If you don't have the ability to have all of those people fill different roles, you got to have one person that has it all. I mean, I see so many counties that maybe only have one position, but they're going to hire somebody that has one or the other. I know it's going to cost more. I know it's going to take more time to find somebody that has both. But I mean, you're trying to fill a position that has to work with law enforcement, with legal, with risk management, with a collection of stakeholders, with the public. They have to know how to talk to all of those groups. And you don't get that if you just have one side of the story. I mean, I would classify myself as a jack of all trades and an expert in none because of that. I've worked in crisis management. I've worked in emergency management. I've worked in security. I'm not going to take on the title of saying I'm an expert in any of those, but you still have to be valuable to a team there.
You know the end of that phrase, right?
Oh no.
Say what you just said. I'll say the end.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Is better than being a master of one.
True statement.
Heck yeah. I'm the same kind of. I would say I would call myself like a generalist. Like I've been all over the place, and it's been a lot more fun. And I get to interview people like you, and learn from different perspectives every single week. And so you can still like quote unquote consider yourself, if you have both sides of that coin, somebody who's proficient, and still be teachable and wanting to learn from other people. Like, I think that's totally fine. Pete Gaynor is one of the most experienced leaders I've ever met. He's on a podcast with me on March 15th, so that's tomorrow, but this podcast will be coming out after that. When he was talking to me, he was like, yeah, I'd really like to like interview people to learn more about like the way they do it. I'm like, so I think that's fine. Like why are we all pushing ourselves to be something from the perspective of like one person thing and the management? I agree with you. I think it's okay to say you're not an expert, but I think it's also important to advocate to leadership saying, I want to be involved in these processes.
Yep.
Yeah. Like another person I should have back on the podcast is Kevin Coleman. His entire experience was federal. He was amazing on the national strike team. I mean, that guy is probably the best resource unit leader probably in the history of the United States. Seriously. and he went over and he took a job at the city of Alexandria, and he's working under the fire department now as an EM. And I was curious of like how that was going to go, and I just saw him in Las Vegas like a month ago, and like his whole world just was like it's just expanding rapidly because he's now seeing it from a completely different angle. The guy was already like an expert in my mind because all the response experience, but now from the other angle, he's just whole other level. I mean, you're the same way, right? Just like we need more people who are wanting to be a generalist.
Yep.
So, how do you, or what advice would you give to the field of becoming more of a generalist besides like advocating for response experience?
I would say there's a trend going on that we're trying to pinhole new hires for the experience that we want them to have. If you are someone coming out of college with a degree in criminal justice, with a degree, I mean, my background's political science. If you're coming out of a university that has some sort of critical thinking skill, if you're coming out of the job field that you have some sort of critical thinking skill, stop turning away good people because they weren't EMS, law enforcement. They don't maybe necessarily have the foundation for entry level positions. Because if you can critically think, if you can communicate, if you can be trained, you have the opportunity to bring up a really good emergency manager. That being said, understand the difference between when you're hiring for entry level and when you're hiring for advanced. Because if you're hiring somebody to run your program, there's things that they probably need to know. You can't just say, yeah, you know what, you've done fire EMS for years. This is probably a great option for you. Put them through the ringer. I'm a full believer in interviews having projects to show that you can actually do something. But we can't keep saying that you have to have XYZ to be able to work in this field. There needs to be a minimum standard, but you can't say that it's the only thing that can work here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for all industries, right? Like, there's always the exception to the rule, but you have to have the rule.
Yep.
The Readiness Lab is pushing very hard to create the rules. We're like really tired of the lack of standardization, and quite frankly, while there's lots of fans of some organizations in my company, I am not. You know, I don't think an events management company should be creating standards for emergency management, and they're really not. Like they're just not. I think it's great to have those clubs come together and share ideas and what's worked for me and what's not worked for me and how to bend the rules and do you know the rules, and I think all that is phenomenal. But there is truly no standardization in our field,
Yep.
and therefore I think as a field, as a profession, we're hurting ourselves because we don't come off as professional to the people we work with sometimes because they don't know what they're going to get. And I've now said all my normal talking points that I typically say that gets lots of comments into my email. So I will probably stop it there. But you know, Sarah, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Obviously, you know your stuff. It's fun to hear you talk about University of Kentucky and compare that to the Kentucky Derby and events management, and hopefully your boss either gives you a raise or I'm going to hire you before he does or she does. But either way, like it's truly a pleasure talking to you. If you could just end our podcast by sharing some advice for anybody who's listening, especially those who want to get into like the unique perspective of stadium or events management EM, like what a cool way to do the job. I don't know, your advice.
Go find the smallest event that you have in your county because they probably need some help. I mean, you're going to have these county parades, county events that if you have a volunteer, that even if you just listen to the podcast, it gets you a foundation to go in there and help. Volunteer. That's going to be your best way to get in the door.
You know, I love asking you questions because your answers are always different than what I think what would come out, and it's typically better. It's always better. I appreciate that, and quite frankly, I don't know why people. We hear this a lot from people like you who know their job very well. They say volunteer more, and we could all use a little more local help. Volunteer where you're at. You know, if it's my kid's preschool, I volunteered to write their emergency plan, like whatever it is. You know, it also helps keep your chops up. So wonderful advice. Again, always a pleasure to talking with you. And I'm glad that, the new job is working out well. It sounds like it's going great. So awesome. All right, everybody. If you got something out of this episode, which you should have, because Sarah's amazing, You don't hire her because I'm trying to hire her, apparently. That's a new thing. Hopefully there's no repercussions there. But seriously, like, subscribe, the whole deal. Give us that 5-star rating, and we'll see you for the next one. Peace.